even though we have cameras everywhere, it seems like it's impossible for all of us to agree on what it is that we're actually seeing. People film the cops film the people, someone's ring cam films the people and the cops, and there's a flock camera up on the lamppost that films the people, the cops, and the ring cam. And we still end up arguing over what all those videos are showing. What's going on? Quite a bit, actually. Making sense of what we see is a complex cognitive process. And more often than not, when people disagree over what video evidence is showing, it ain't our eyes that are lying. We need to understand this cognitive process if we want to become less vulnerable to propaganda and manipulation. One of those psychological mechanisms is called the culpable control model of blame. When we see something like that dashcam video where innocent people are actively put in harm's way, we have a psychological need to identify the person responsible, or simply put, we want to blame someone.
We're all trying to find the guy who did this and give him a spanking.
Our instinct is to blame someone who is culturally different from us, in other words, someone who's not in our tribe. We then have to determine if the person acted voluntarily, and that decision can be influenced by whether or not the person engages in behavior that our tribe disapproves of. So, if our tribe disapproves of drug use, and we find out that the suspect in a crime is a drug user, we are more likely to blame that person, even if that person's drug use had nothing to do with the crime in question. Another factor that influences how we evaluate visual evidence is called cultural cognition of risk. This theory posits that we decide what constitutes dangerous behavior based on things like our cultural background and our upbringing. If you grew up in a city, you might not think twice about taking the subway at night, whereas someone from a rural area might think you're insane for even considering it. Then we have identity protective cognition. As we've covered in previous videos, humans are extremely tribal creatures, and we place great value on maintaining our status in the tribal groups we belong to, both online and in the real world. That means when we see something that confirms our tribal values and beliefs, we all turn into Fox Mulder. When we see something that challenges those beliefs, more often than not, we simply reject it completely, or we start to twist it around in our heads in order to force it into an interpretation that conforms with our existing beliefs. Finally, when we're evaluating video evidence, we also have to contend with our naive realism. We all have a natural belief that we are rational people whose lived experience makes us good judges of the world around us. And if I'm a rational person, then everybody who agrees with me must also be a rational person. And the ones who don't, well, they're nuts. This is where most online arguments start.